If Göbekli Tepe hadn't been found, none of this would have happened. But it's led to a widespread interest in the whole area. So while excavation may have stopped at Göbekli Tepe or may have slowed down, it is continuing elsewhere.
Somewhere in the loose fill of a building older than any city on Earth, diggers pulled out roughly 700 pieces of human bone. 3 of the skulls had deep grooves cut straight down them, front to back, carved with flint. One of those 3 had a hole drilled through the left side of the top, 5 millimeters wide, with red ochre still sitting on the bone. And then the anthropologist who examined them, Julia Gresky, pointed out that the hole sat in exactly the right place to hang that skull upright on a cord. Those grooves are not scratches. Under a microscope, they show pass after pass with a flint blade, cut deep, running along the top of the head from the forehead backward. On one skull, the cutting carries down onto the jaw. The most complete of the 3 came out of a patch of red ochre, and that is the one with the hole in it. Gresky and her colleagues published the work in Science Advances in June 2017. Grooves like these had never been recorded anywhere, in any period. And there are no graves here. In 3 decades of digging at this hill, nobody has found a single burial. 700 pieces of people, loose in the dirt that packed those rooms shut. In one of the round buildings, a life-size wild boar came out of the ground, with paint still on it. Red on the tongue, black and white across the body. Limestone, 130 centimeters tall, standing on a long carved bench between 2 of the biggest pillars in the room. Lee Clare of the German Archaeological Institute, who runs the excavation, called it the first painted statue anyone has recovered from that period. The hill is Gobekli Tepe, in Sanliurfa province in southeastern Turkey. If a hanging skull and a painted boar sound like the strangest things buried in that ground, keep watching. The skulls are not the only sign that these people were fixated on heads. One of the carved pillars shows a figure holding out a human head like an offering. Another shows a headless human body with a vulture standing over it, wings spread. A stone statue of a person was found with its head removed, and the break looks deliberate rather than accidental. At Karahantepe, 25 miles away, reliefs show predators biting down on human heads. Gresky pointed out that skull cults are not rare in this part of the world. Neolithic communities across Anatolia and the Levant buried their dead, dug them up again, took the skulls, and displayed them. At Jericho, they packed the faces with plaster and set shells in the eye sockets. But nobody grooved them like this. The Gobekli Tepe carvings are crude compared to the animal work on the pillars, which is strange on its own, because the same hands could cut a fox so precisely you can count the claws. The closest match anyone has found for the groove pattern is not archaeological at all. It comes from the Naga people of India, who hung skulls on cords, and the cords sat almost exactly where these grooves run. Nobody has explained why, so the grooves stay grooves. How does a group of hunters and foragers, with no farming, no pottery, and no writing, end up carving a hill like this? Start with the age, because the age is what breaks people. The oldest building phases at Gobekli Tepe date to around 9600 BC. Stonehenge went up about 6,000 years later. The Great Pyramid is younger still by another 500 years or so. When these rings of stone were standing and in use, there were no cities anywhere on the planet, no metal, no wheel, no writing of any kind, and nothing anyone would call a farm. The mound itself is artificial. It stands 15 meters high and covers around 9 hectares, and most of that height is material the builders put there on purpose. Underneath it sit the round buildings, ringed by walls with T-shaped pillars set into them at regular spacing, and 2 much larger pillars standing alone in the middle of each ring. Those central stones reach 5.5 meters. The heaviest weigh around 10 tons. They were cut out of the limestone bedrock of the same ridge, quarried loose, dragged uphill, and dropped into sockets carved into the rock floor. If you are wondering how anyone shifted a 10-ton block without a wheel or a draft animal, so is everyone who works there. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who started the modern excavation in 1995, spent the rest of his life arguing that this hill flipped the order of history. The old model ran in one direction. Farming came first, then villages, then surplus, then temples. Gobekli Tepe sat in the wrong slot. The monuments came first, the farms came after. Look at one of those T-shaped pillars long enough, and it stops reading as architecture. They have arms. Low relief arms run down the sides of the shaft, and the hands come around to the front, fingers meeting just above a carved belt. Some of the belts have buckles. Below several of them hangs a fox pelt, carved as a piece of clothing. The flat top bar of the T is a head, seen from the side, with no face on it. That reading was the working assumption for years, and for years it stayed an assumption. There was no pillar with a face. In October 2025, there was one. Excavators at Karahantepe, the second great site in this landscape, lifted a T-shaped stone with a human face carved into its head, a heavy brow, deep-set eye sockets, a broad, straight nose. Necmi Karul of Istanbul University, who directs the work across the region, called it the clearest evidence yet that these pillars were meant to be people. 11,000 years, and the thing still has a face. That single find reframes every ring on both hills. If the pillars are people, then a Gobekli Tepe building is not an empty stone circle. It is a crowd, standing in a ring, facing inward, with two much larger figures in the middle. Which brings us back to the Boar. It sat in Special Building D, the best preserved ring at Gobekli Tepe. The German Archaeological Institute announced it in October 2023, and the dating puts it in the early part of the pre-pottery Neolithic B, roughly 8700 to 8200 BC. What matters is not the animal, it is the paint. Traces of red, black, and white pigment survived on the limestone, red on the tongue, and black and white across the body. Archaeologists had suspected for decades that the pillars and statues here were colored. Rain, frost, and 11,000 years of burial had removed the proof. Now there is proof, and it changes what those buildings looked like. Colored pillars, colored animals, colored walls, all of it lit by fire and packed into a space you entered on your hands and knees. The Boar stood directly below a large stone with a round hole cut through it, the kind excavators call a porthole stone. On a slab beneath it, someone carved snakes, a snake head, and a shape like the letter H, one of the symbols that repeats across these sites without anyone being able to say what it means. There is a pattern in the carvings that nobody has fully cracked. Go around the pillars at Gobekli Tepe and count what is on them. Foxes with their teeth bared. Snakes, dozens of them, pouring down the stone in columns. Boars with tusks. Scorpions, spiders, cranes, aurochs, vultures. Almost every animal is either a predator, a scavenger, or something that can kill a person. Now go into the fill and count the bones. Gazelle, mostly. The animal these people actually hunted and ate in bulk barely appears on the walls. So the carvings are not a record of dinner. Whatever those animals meant to the people cutting them, it ran closer to fear or power than to food, and every one of them was placed on a stone figure shaped like a human being. And whatever those rooms were for, people ate there. 6 large limestone vessels have come out of Gobekli Tepe, barrel and trough-shaped, cut from single blocks. The biggest hold up to 160 liters. They are too heavy to move, which means they are fixtures, built into the rooms they sit in. Some of them carry gray-black residue on the inside of the base. A laboratory at the Technical University of Munich tested that residue and got a partial positive for calcium oxalate. Oxalate builds up when grain is soaked, mashed, and fermented. In plain terms, it is what beer leaves behind. The team that published it was careful. They called the results preliminary and said so in print. But at the bottom of one of those vessels, excavators also found the complete shoulder blade of an onager, a wild ass. Somebody had been in that room with 160 liters of something fermented and a butchered animal. There is no grain storage anywhere on the site. Whatever was processed here was consumed here. Now hold that next to a piece of genetics that has nothing to do with archaeology. In 1997, Manfred Hoehn and an international team published a study in Science. They collected hundreds of lines of wild einkorn wheat from across the Fertile Crescent, ran DNA fingerprinting on all of it, and asked one question. Which wild population is the closest living relative of the wheat we grow today? The answer came back as a single mountain range, Karakadag, a volcanic massif in southeastern Turkey. Karakadag sits about 30 kilometers from Gobekli Tepe. On a clear day, you can see it from the site. Hold that distance, because everything that comes next leans on it. So the oldest monumental architecture on Earth stands within walking distance of the birthplace of domesticated wheat, and the people who built it were not farmers. Wild einkorn and wild barley turn up in the deposits. Domesticated grain does not. They were harvesting, grinding, and fermenting wild cereals at scale centuries before anybody planted a field. Schmidt's argument was that the building came first and the farming followed, because a workforce that size has to be fed. It is still an argument. It has not been settled. But the geography sits there and refuses to be a coincidence. Think about what that would mean if it holds. For most of the last century, the story ran the other way round. The climate warmed, wild grain got easy, people settled down to farm it, and once they had spare food, they built temples with the surplus. Belief was the luxury at the end of the process. Flip it, and belief is the engine. Something made these people willing to spend generations cutting 10-ton figures out of a hillside and feeding everyone who kept showing up to help is exactly the problem that farming solves. On that reading, farming was the bill that came due for the building. If you were taught in school that civilization began in Egypt or Mesopotamia, this hill was already old, buried and forgotten before either of them laid a single brick. Up to this point, Gobekli Tepe had been the whole story. That was about to flip. 25 miles southeast, on a ridge in the Tek Mountains, sits Karahantepe. Surveyors recorded it in 1997 and then left it alone. Excavation only began in 2019. 6 years of digging have exposed something in the range of 5% of the site. That 5% has produced more than 250 T-shaped pillars, an area of roughly 10 to 14 hectares depending on whether you count the quarries, and a set of rooms carved down into living rock instead of built up from it. The builders could have stopped at one hill. They did not. At Karahantepe, the floor, the benches, the pillars, and the walls of some rooms are all one piece of stone. The stone was already there. Everything else was removed around it. Carroll has described the bedrock work as prehistoric engineering, and standing inside it makes the point better than any measurement because there are no joints anywhere. The room is whatever was left behind after everything around it got cut away. 2 tiers of stone benches run around one of the open areas, cut from the same rock, facing in toward a floor. Somebody sat on those. Somebody watched something happen down there. The quarry scars are still on the hillside. Once they are pointed out to you, they are impossible to miss. Long, shallow trenches where blocks were cut free and levered out. One T-shaped pillar was never finished. It is still lying where it was being worked, half separated from the rock it was born in, abandoned mid-job 11,000 years ago. The cone-shaped mounds on top of the hill have nothing to do with any of this. Those are Roman burial mounds, dropped on the summit thousands of years later by people who had no idea what was underneath them. If Karahantepe had stopped at the pillars, this would be a very different story. The room the site is now known for is a chamber cut into that bedrock, reached through a low crawl space from the main gathering area. Inside it, 11 pillars rise straight out of the floor. They were not carried in and stood up. They were left behind when the rest of the rock was cut away, which means the entire room had to be planned before the first strike of the first tool. Carroll has described the shaping as one of the earliest and most monumental examples of fertility symbolism found anywhere. At the end of the row, a human head pushes out of the wall. It is carved in the round, bearded, with heavy lips and a flat crown, and the neck behind it does not run into shoulders. It runs sideways along the wall as a snake. The top of that head sits level with the tops of the 11 pillars. The chamber has one way in and a different way out. Carroll reads the layout as a route, a procession that entered at one end, passed in front of the head, and left at the other. A channel cut into the rock once carried water into the space. Next to it lies a basin the excavators call a pool, with a snake picked out along the rim in rows of small drilled dots. There is one more claim about that head, and it needs to be labeled for what it is. Hugh Newman, a researcher who has documented the site across several seasons, reported that on the morning of the winter solstice, light entering the chamber falls directly onto the carved face. That observation has not come through the excavation team's own publication record, so it sits outside the peer-reviewed material. But it was photographed, it was witnessed, and the excavators have not disputed the geometry. Whether it was designed that way is the open question. The head is still in the wall. The sun still comes up. Excavators tend to be cautious with alignment claims, and they have reason to be. A ruin with enough openings in it will line up with something on some morning of the year purely by chance, and prehistoric sites attract that kind of arithmetic, the way lamps attract insects. But this chamber was not built. It was carved out of solid rock, in one piece, by people who had to decide where every surface went before they cut. If a room like that catches the sun on a specific day, the accident explanation gets harder to hold, not easier. The answer was already sitting in the next enclosure. Nobody had reached it yet. In September 2023, in a new enclosure at the top of the hill, the team found a statue of a man. He is 2.5 meters tall, seated, and he was fixed to a stone bench so firmly that when the figure snapped in two, the legs stayed exactly where they had been set. The upper half was lying on the floor in front of them. The carving is not stylized. The ribs are cut in one by one. So are the spine and the shoulder blades. There is a V-shaped collar around the neck and deep lines marking every finger. It is the earliest realistic depiction of a specific human being anyone has recovered, and it reads two ways at once, because a body carved with its ribs and spine showing is how the dead get shown across the Neolithic, while the posture is that of somebody sitting up, awake, holding himself in place. In front of the same bench stood a vulture, carved with a heavy beak and its wings folded around its own chest. On the floor below, both of them lay a worked stone plate. Set into the north wall between two large T-pillars was a great circular hold stone. Everything in that room was arranged, none of it was dropped there, and the next find is the one the old explanation has the hardest time absorbing. Then Elim Ozdogan published what was carved on a bench in a village called Serpent, about an hour from both hills. Modern houses sit on top of the site, so only half of one communal building has been cleared. That building is 11 meters across and cut into bedrock. Running along a bench inside it is a panel of relief carving roughly 3.7 meters long, holding 5 figures. On one side, a man faces a bull. The horns are exaggerated, cut far larger than a bull's horns should be. On the other, a man stands between 2 leopards, one on each side, and their teeth are exaggerated exactly the same way. One of the men holds something in his right hand that reads as a snake, or possibly a rattle. Ozdogan published the panel in the journal Antiquity in 2022 and made a careful, specific claim about it. Older art exists. Cave paintings run tens of thousands of years further back. Those are images of things. The Serpent panel is 2 connected moments involving the same characters, which makes it the earliest known scene and the earliest surviving attempt we have of anybody trying to tell a story in pictures. The radiocarbon dates were still pending when the paper came out. The working estimate places it in the 9th millennium BC, near the end of Gobekli Tepe's life. And the scene on that bench is not the strangest thing this landscape handed over last year. Then, in November 2025, at a briefing at the Karahantepe Visitor Center, Turkey's Minister of Culture and Tourism, Mehmet Nuri Ersoy, laid out the results of that season. At Tepe, a smaller mound in the same group, excavators had found 2 human faces carved onto dressed limestone blocks in a platform. One is worked in high relief, standing well out of the stone. The other is shallow and more stylized. Both face north. The proportions do not match Gobekli Tepe. They do not match Karahantepe either. The curve of the cheek, the build of the brow, and the handling of the nose all sit slightly off from the neighboring sites, which points at something nobody expected this early: a local style. Villages a few hours apart, inside a culture everyone had assumed was uniform, carving faces their own way. From the same season came a bead of black serpentinite, small enough to wear, polished smooth, with a human face carved on each side, looking in opposite directions. That bead matters more than its size suggests. Everything else in this story is enormous and fixed in place, pillars you cannot lift and rooms you cannot move. The bead is the opposite. It is portable, personal, and somebody wore it. Whatever these carved faces meant, the meaning was small enough to hang around a neck and carry between villages, which is exactly how ideas travel. Ersoy also announced a sculpture from Serpent with an elongated head and its mouth carved shut, which the team has been describing as a death mask. Nobody is claiming to know what it represents. It is on the table with everything else. For a while, the picture actually held together. Gobekli Tepe was a temple. Nomadic hunters walked in from the surrounding country, gathered, worshipped, and walked back out. Nobody lived there. That did not last. The Turkish government launched the Tepeler project in 2020, and it now runs across 12 sites in Şanlıurfa province. Gobekli Tepe is one of them. Karahantepe is another. Serpent, Tepe, Tepe, Harbetsuvan Tepesi, and the rest fill in a landscape stretching more than 100 kilometers. These are not separate discoveries. They are one culture with a dozen addresses, and several of those addresses have never been dug at all. Then the excavators made one call that changed how every building on both hills gets read. They kept digging past the monumental rings. Underneath and around them at Gobekli Tepe, they found domestic structures. Cisterns cut into rock to hold water. Ordinary buildings. Carul now avoids the word temple entirely. He calls these places gathering places and points out that Karahantepe has more than one gathering area, which raises a question the temple model cannot answer. If one of them is the temple, what are the others? Clare has taken it a step further in his own published work. He argues these communities had leaders you cannot see in the archaeology, people whose authority came from something other than wealth, because there is no wealth here to inherit. His candidates are storytellers, hunters, and ritual specialists, and he frames the whole period as a crisis, a moment when a way of life that had held for tens of thousands of years started coming apart, and somebody had to hold the group together while it happened. Speaking at Karahantepe in late 2025, Claire put the shift plainly. Every building the team studies, he said, is a small glimpse into someone's life, and every layer brings them closer to an individual. Which leaves the hardest question on either hill still sitting there. These buildings were not abandoned, they were filled in. At the end of a building's life, the people using it packed the interior with rubble, stone chips, animal bone and dirt right up over the tops of the pillars and walked away. The fill is not collapse. It is not silt washed in across centuries. It was carried in by hand and placed. That is where the 700 fragments of human bone came from. That is where the carved skulls came from. They were in the fill. At Karahantepe, the same thing happened. Room after room, packed solid and closed. Carul has floated the word ceremony for it, a decommissioning, something closer to a funeral for a building than a cleanup. And the material they used to fill those rooms was not random rubble scraped off the hill. It carried flint tools, animal bone, broken sculpture, and human remains, which means somebody selected it, or at minimum, somebody swept up everything that had happened in that room and put it back inside before sealing the door, which, looking back, was either an act of enormous respect or the exact opposite of one, and there is currently no way to tell which. Burying something you cut by hand over years is not neglect. Somebody decided the room was finished, and the ground is nowhere near empty. Geophysical survey at Gobekli Tepe has picked up at least 16 more stone circles, still buried under the mound, unexcavated, undated, and untouched. This is the point where the tidy version of the story runs out. In July 2024, Martin Sweatman of the University of Edinburgh published a paper in the journal Time and Mind, arguing that one particular stone at Gobekli Tepe is a calendar. The stone is Pillar 43, in Enclosure D, the same building as the painted boar. It is covered in animals, and among them run rows of small V-shaped marks. Sweatman reads each V as a day. His count produces 12 lunar months plus 11 extra days, a lunisolar year, which would make it the oldest object of its kind by thousands of years. He goes further, tying the carving to a comet strike around 10,850 BC and the long, cold snap that followed it. The excavators do not accept it, and they have said so in detail. The German Archaeological Institute's published response points out that the date the astronomical reading requires runs 700 to 1,000 years earlier than the oldest radiocarbon date from Enclosure D. It also questions the assumption sitting underneath the entire argument, which is that a group of stars carries the same meaning for people separated by 10,000 years and half a continent. Both sides are still publishing. Neither has moved. What is not in dispute is that somebody cut those V marks, in rows, deliberately, on a stone that also carries a vulture, a scorpion, and a headless human figure. The 2026 season added something quieter and much harder to argue with. Laboratory work on material from Karahantepe reconstructed what these people were eating while they cut all this stone. Wild gazelle, legumes, no domesticated grain, no herds, no fields. The bedrock rooms, the carved pillars, the painted statues, and the sealed chambers were all built by people who were still hunting their dinner. The finds are traveling now. A TAS Tepeler exhibition opens at the James Simon Gallery in Berlin this year, and the Tokyo National Museum takes it in 2027. As of this season, around 95% of Karahantepe is still underground, and 11 other sites in the same landscape have never been excavated. The head with the serpent's neck is still in its wall. The skull with the drilled hole is in a laboratory drawer, and nobody can say whose it was. So tell us in the comments which one you would open first, the sealed chambers at Karahantepe or the 16 circles still sitting under Gobekli Tepe. We read every one. There is another hill in this same region where a building was sealed the same way, and what came out from under it is on screen now.